chapter 2, verses 6 to 12. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them. As they both were standing by the Jordan, then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them into pieces. This is the story of our faith.
The second reading from the book of Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 to 42. Now about 8 days after these saying, Jesus took them with him, Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was out to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified, and they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silence, and in those days told no one any of things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child. Suddenly, a spirit seized him, and all at once he shrieks and convulses him, and until he foams at the mouth. He mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I beg your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here. While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsion, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. This is the story of our faith.
Todd suggested that when I'm doing worship leadership and singing in the choir, maybe I should have a skateboard to get down here faster. Fortunately, we're in good hands with Palinapa and Naomi doing the readings, so appreciate their leadership. So here we are in chapter 9 in Luke, which is really the pivot point of this gospel. Until now, it's all been good news. We get the wonderful
Do something about the sound.
at Christmas, then Jesus' baptism, the temptation in the desert, which he passes with flying colors. And then once he starts his ministry, it's just one success after another. He's healing people, he's casting out demons, he's raising people from the dead. There's the feeding of the 5,000. There's a palpable sense of excitement building around the ministry of Jesus. The disciples are more and more convinced he is the Messiah. And they've gotten in on the ground floor. So when he comes into power, they are going to be glorified with him. This episode of the Transfiguration seems to conform to the disciples' hopes. Here, Jesus is standing on the mountain with two of the superheroes of the Jewish scriptures, Elijah and Moses. A little bit like a mountaintop meeting between I don't know, Superman, Batman, and Iron Man. Fill in the blanks, whichever your favorite superheroes are. This is the dream team, the Avengers. It's also highly symbolic. What this is saying is that Jesus is the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets, with Moses representing the law and Elijah representing the prophets. Now, I get a little nervous when we reference Jewish tradition to back up our messianic claims about Jesus. Our Christian tradition sees Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy because the Gospels writers did such a good job of weaving in references to the Hebrew Scriptures in order to convince their readers that Jesus was the Messiah. But it's important to remember the Hebrew Bible stands on its own. It is a complete canon and a singular tradition. It is possible to read the Hebrew Scriptures as our Jewish friends do and not interpret those texts as self-evidently pointing to Jesus, the Messiah. We can hold those two things in tension without thinking that our tradition somehow replaces Jewish tradition or that God broke God's covenant with the Jewish people. But it is clear the message that the gospel writer here in Luke is trying to convey is that Jesus is the Messiah and is of equal importance to Elijah and Moses. And there are parallels here between the Jesus story and the accounts of Moses and Elijah. As Jesus is on the mountain, his face and clothing become dazzlingly bright. This recalls the face of Moses when he received the law that was on the stone tablets. Luke is recalling that passage in Exodus, which we read a couple weeks ago, where Moses' face was shining so brightly after he had been in God's presence that he had to wear a veil when he was talking to other people. The literal meaning of transfiguration is changing the face or appearance, and that happens to both Moses and to Jesus. Luke even takes another step towards this comparison with Moses in verse 31. Our translation today says, "They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem." But the actual word Luke uses for departure is exodus, his exodus to Jerusalem. It's a very meaningful word in the context of Moses. Maybe a little too on the nose. Like, okay, Luke, we get it. He's the new Moses. You don't have to hit us over the head with it. The parallel with Elijah is also interesting because in this case, it's kind of a foreshadowing. We read the passage today where Elijah is taken up into heaven on the fiery chariot. This foreshadows how the resurrected Jesus is going to ascend into heaven in Acts, chapter 1, verse 9. After saying this, he was taken up into a cloud while they were watching, and they could no longer see him. And they strained to see him rising into heaven. Two white-robed men suddenly stood among them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why are you standing here staring into heaven? Jesus has been taken from you into heaven, but someday he will return from heaven in the same way you saw him go." This echoes the tradition around Elijah that since he was taken up into heaven, he didn't die. So one day he will return, and that will be the sign that the Messiah is on his way. That's why in Jewish tradition, during the Passover Seder, you leave a place at the table for Elijah in anticipation of his return. Now, the disciples react to Jesus' transfiguration moment with typical Three Stooges-like precision. First, they're either asleep or almost asleep around the time Jesus has finished praying and all the fireworks start happening. This won't be the first time they fall asleep at a crucial moment in the Jesus story. Also happens in Gethsemane, just before he's arrested. Then Peter talks about setting up tabernacles or dwellings for Elijah, Moses, and Jesus, which when you think about it makes no sense. Moses and Elijah are clearly some kind of supernatural manifestation, and they are probably not in need of shelter. But it wouldn't be a good gospel story if Peter didn't stick his foot in his mouth. In this case, he's showing the bewilderment and confusion of the disciples. Then a cloud descends on them, and they get even more scared as they hear the voice of God. Then just as quickly as it started, everything vanishes. The cloud clears away, Elijah and Moses vanish, and it's just Jesus standing there with them alone. This moment of transfiguration is what's known as a theophany, which means a direct encounter with God. So this gives Jesus something else in common with Elijah and Moses, because they also experienced theophanies. A theophany could bring about a feeling of awe or an intense sense of holiness, as when Moses removes his sandals in front of the burning bush because he believes he's standing on holy ground. Oftentimes, when it happens in the Bible, it brings about confusion and fear. And that seems to be what's happening to the disciples. When they come back down the mountain, they're literally speechless. They don't say anything about the experience they have just had to anyone. The story has a kind of darkness to it as well, because in the passage just before this, Jesus has told his disciples for the first time about his pending death. In verses 22 and 23, he tells them, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised from the dead." Then he says, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." It's safe to say a public trial and humiliating death is not what the disciples are expecting from Jesus, the Messiah. This little tag on the lectionary text where Jesus and the disciples encounter a boy who's possessed by a demon also is a shift in the narrative. Until now, it's been Jesus who's done all the miracles. Any kind of wonders, any kind of driving out of demons, that kind of thing. But the text tells us the disciples were either unwilling to try or unable to succeed at casting out the demon out of this boy. When Jesus hears this, he doesn't say, "Oh, well, try again next time. It's okay." Instead, he lays into them, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" It's as if Jesus is trying to tell them, "Hey, I'm not always going to be here, so you have to start picking up the torch." The true pivot point in this chapter really happens in verse 51, which is just after the passage we read. And it's the idea of the journey. It says, "When the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem." Up until now, Jesus' ministry has taken place in his home territory of Galilee. But from now on, Jesus and the disciples are going on a journey to Jerusalem, where the events of the Easter narrative will take place. Some of the commentaries I read in preparing this sermon suggested to just leave this story as it is. This is a theophany, a direct experience with God. It is completely outside our experience. Don't talk about mountaintop experiences. I resisted the temptation to title this sermon, "Jesus' Big Glow Up." The Transfiguration is something wholly other, in which Jesus and the disciples experience the holy other, Holy. I think there's some truth to this idea of sort of letting it go and letting it be what it is. But there's also a couple points in this narrative that deserve a little more scrutiny. One thing that strikes me about this transfiguration moment is that it's a strangely intimate experience. Jesus only brings 3 of his disciples up the mountain. Whatever he intends to reveal about himself, he only wants to show his closest companions. At its heart, the Transfiguration is a moment of revelation. Jesus is revealing something to his friends that they may have suspected about him, but he is confirming it to them for the first time. There is one thing they're very glad to hear. Yes, he is the Messiah. But there's something they also don't want to hear. Being the Messiah is not going to lead to earthly glory and political power. Jesus shows them the fullness of who he is and the truth about himself. And as powerful as Jesus seems here, he's revealing something deeply personal, which also means he's making himself vulnerable. He doesn't know how his friends are going to react to this information. In fact, they seem quite scared and confused. And so in the same way, when we stand in the fullness of who we are and reveal the truth about ourselves, we may also feel both power and vulnerability. You might call this a transfiguration moment. There are a lot of examples of transfiguration moments. I think about the experience that many of us have in the LGBTQ community of coming out. When you reveal to someone who you are, and then there's this freighted moment after that, when you're just kind of waiting to see what their reaction is going to be. It's a moment of power, but also a moment of vulnerability. I think about young people when they begin to follow their own path rather than the path planned out for them by their parents or family. Maybe a young person telling their parents they're not going to college, or that they're going to move across the country or around the world when everybody thought they were going to stay put. Or informing family or their faith community that their beliefs have changed and they no longer see themselves as part of the denomination or religion that they were raised in. These are also transfiguration moments. I think about things that happen in counseling sessions or in quiet conversation between friends. When someone reveals a past trauma or wound they've suffered, a violation against their body, mind, or spirit. Talking about something like that to someone else is both a moment of vulnerability and a moment of power. Because talking about traumas we experience is a way to begin to find wholeness again. These transfiguration moments, when someone stands in the fullness of who they are and tells the truth about themselves, may not be a great theophany like we have in the passage today, but they are nevertheless holy moments, and we should see them that way. Both if we are the ones revealing the truth, or if we are privileged enough to have someone reveal the truth about themselves to us. The other thing that strikes me is that passage just before the one we read, where Jesus says, if we would be his disciples, we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. There's a strange contradiction in this saying, because for Jesus, taking up the cross was not a denial of himself. It was the fulfillment of who he really was as the Messiah. When he sets his face toward Jerusalem, this is where his transfiguration moment, the revealing of who he was, becomes a transformation moment where he begins to take action. He is living fully and completely into who God was calling him to be. So maybe that's true for us as well. That to take up the cross and follow Jesus is about living fully into the people that God has called us to be. I can't tell any of us exactly what that means for our own lives, but there may be some hints as to where we could look to find out. Often, the transformative action we are being asked to do has to do with the transfiguring truth we have acknowledged about ourselves. Moments of transfiguration tend to be pretty formative experiences. They tend to relate to things that are deeply important to our personalities. And so wherever we have stood in the fullness of who we are and told the truth about ourselves, that could be a starting place on the journey God is calling us to take. Use an example from my own life, just as an example. An important transfiguration moment for me was when I came out as a gay man. This led me to getting involved in LGBTQ activism, both in the church and in secular settings. It also influenced the classes I've taught in my work as an adjunct professor. This is an important part of what it has meant for me to live fully into the person that I feel God is calling me to be. Another place we might look for what kind of path we're trying to take is in that list of things that we all have that we would like to do and that we feel like could maybe make a positive difference in the world, but maybe haven't yet committed to doing. Maybe it has to do with volunteering or spending time in our communities. Maybe it's starting something like a program or a ministry. Maybe it's sharing our knowledge through teaching and mentoring others. Maybe it's just sitting down and starting to write or to paint or to compose. And then perhaps we're not quite ready to name what it would mean to live into the fullness of who God is calling us to be. Maybe right now it's just something that exists around the periphery of your awareness. Maybe it's like a little fish hook that you feel in your belly, and it feels like God's reeling you in, but you're not exactly sure where you're going. That's fine too. Sometimes the path is just to remain on the path, and eventually you'll figure out where it's leading. Now, I don't want to fall into what I call in my classes on popular culture systematic oprology. This is not the gospel of you go girl or you do you. In taking up the cross, there is self-denial. You may have to let go of baggage from the past. You may have to face your fears or your shadows. You may have to give up illusions about yourself, have your prejudices punctured, your expectations shattered. You may have to endure the disapproval of society or even family or friends. Again, there's this contradiction that taking up the cross is both a denial of self and a fulfillment of self. So while we're talking about denial, let's talk about Lent. In many parts of the church, it's traditional for people to give up something for Lent, like desserts or alcohol or shopping. I've noticed we Presbyterians don't usually do that for whatever reason. But maybe what we can do instead is to create a bit of space, a bit of silence where we might listen for God's call to us. If you can carve a little bit of space out in your day, I'd like to suggest a couple questions you might ask yourself. The first one might be called the transfiguration question. Who would I be if I stood in the fullness of who I am and told the truth about myself? And the transformation question, what would I do if I lived fully into the person God is calling me to be? My hope for you, for all of us during Lent, is that we may find a little time, a little space to consider these questions. And that ultimately we may find ourselves transfigured, and that we may find ourselves transformed.